In the dead heat of July, while the rest of Black Hollow Basin soaked in a rare, warm season, Ronan Pike was splitting wood. On the north slope overlooking the town, he worked alone, not one cord or two. He was building walls of it, stacks taller than a man, set in rows so straight and tight they looked measured by a ruler. He hung strips of venison on drying racks that covered half his yard. He sealed every crack in his cabin with a mixture of clay and moss until it looked less like a home and more like a fortress. Down in the valley, they stopped to watch. Laughter drifted up from the porch of Mercer Supply. At the forge, the jeers mixed with the ring of hammers. They didn't understand it. A man living in July, as if January were already at his door. They called it obsession, madness. The laughter spread, the way it always does in a small town. But Ronan never answered it. He only swung the axe again, because Ronan Pike was not preparing for winter. He was preparing for judgment. If stories of frontier grit, of hard-won survival, and forgotten wisdom are what you come here for, you're in the right place. A simple like on this video helps us more than you know, and subscribing ensures these histories don't get lost to time. And no matter where you're watching, from a small town like this one, or a bustling city, let us know down in the comments. And judgment in Ronan Pike's life had come once before. Years earlier, before Black Hollow Basin, before the cabin on the north slope, Ronan had worked a timber camp along the lower edge of the Absaroka Range. It was rough country, good for pine, bad for mercy. He hauled freight in summer, repaired sled runners in fall, and cut roads through drifted timber when winter closed in. His younger brother, Elias, worked the same camp. Elias had a wife named Ruth, and a baby girl still small enough to sleep in a crate lined with wool near the stove. The winter that took them did not begin with drama. That was the lesson. It began early. One storm, then another, then a supply wagon delayed, then turned back, then lost. Men said the road would open in a week, then in 10 days, then soon, which was the word people used when they had run out of facts and still needed comfort. The food did not vanish all at once. It narrowed. Beans were stretched with water. Flour was cut with coarse meal. Bacon grease was saved, then scraped, then gone. Firewood was counted, then recounted, then carried inside in smaller armloads, because no one wanted to see how little remained stacked against the wall. Ruth grew quiet first. Then the child stopped crying with strength. Then Elias began lying in the dark, saying he was only tired, though Ronan could hear the weakness in his breathing and see the color leaving his hands. That was how winter killed when it meant to stay. Not with thunder, not with spectacle, with subtraction. A little less heat, a little less food, a little more waiting. By the time the road was truly gone, the arithmetic had already been done. Ronan buried all three when the thaw loosened the ground enough to take a shovel. He never spoke much about that camp afterward. Men in frontier country learned to keep certain griefs folded inward, but from that year on, he never looked at summer the way other people did. He looked at it as borrowed time, because winter, once cheated, did not forgive. It returned for the balance. That was why Ronan Pike worked the way he did on the north slope above Black Hollow Basin. To the people below, it looked like hoarding. To Ronan, it was a system. By late July, the ground around his cabin had been turned into something closer to a frontier machine than a homestead. Every piece of it served a purpose. Every piece fed the next. He built the drying frames first, 3 tiers high, narrow pine rails. Wire mesh stretched tight so wind could move through from both sides. Wild pears were sliced to the same thickness and laid out in careful rows. Pumpkin slabs followed. Onion greens hung in bundles that rattled softly when the afternoon breeze moved through them. Food dried faster when air could reach both faces. Ronan knew that from years hauling freight, where spoiled food meant wasted miles. Nearby, strips of venison hung beneath a lean smoke shed, high enough to keep wolves curious but distant, low enough to stay inside the drifting column of smoke that rose from a slow fire beneath green wood. Nothing about it was random. Behind the cabin, he dug a stone-lined cold pit into the hillside. Flat rock at the base, packed soil around the sides. A layer of dry ash spread between crates so moisture could not creep upward. The depth was not guessed. It was judged by touch, by the temperature of the earth 3 feet down compared to 1 foot. Then there was the wood. Most men in the basin stacked firewood in one long wall and called it done. Ronan divided it. Kindling first. Thin sticks cut short for quick flame. Stove wood next. Split lengths meant to hold heat through supper and the evening hours. And the thick blocks last. Hard pine and knotty trunk sections meant for nights when the wind screamed and no man wanted to rise from bed to feed the stove again. Each pile had its place. Each place had a purpose. He was not simply storing food and wood. He was designing the rate at which life could be spent. What dried first would be eaten first. What kept longest would remain untouched until the deep months. What burned fast would warm mornings. What burned slow would carry a house through the blackest hours of winter night. Up on the ridge, every rack, every stack, every sealed crack in the cabin walls said the same thing. Survival was not courage. It was logistics. By the middle of August, most of Black Hollow Basin had formed an opinion about the man on the North Ridge. Opinions in a frontier town rarely began in private. They formed in the same 3 places every season. At the scale outside Martha Vale's store, at the forge where iron rang against iron, and outside the small plank chapel after Sunday prayer, where men spoke softer but not necessarily wiser. That summer, the subject kept drifting back to the same name, Ronan Pike. Martha Vale, the practical widow who kept Mercer's Supply running with a sharp pencil and sharper memory, had watched the man hauling sacks of dried pears and bundles of onion greens up the slope for weeks. She shook her head one afternoon while weighing flour for a ranch hand. "Man's working like he expects winter to come twice," she said. A few men laughed. Across the road, sparks leapt from the blacksmith's hammer. Someone said Ronan had stacked enough wood to heat 3 cabins. Someone else said he'd seen the drying racks full again just days after the last batch came down. Then Gideon Thorne spoke. Gideon owned the basin's main storehouse and managed most of the freight contracts that kept Black Hollow supplied through the year. He was not a man who wasted words. He's living like a man, waiting for the end of the world, Gideon said calmly. The men around him nodded, not in cruelty, in agreement, because the basin had its rhythms. Autumn wagons always came through Raven Cut. Flour barrels were replaced. Salt arrived. Tools came in crates from the rail towns to the east. The system had worked for years. Why would this year be different? Up on the ridge, Ronan Pike heard pieces of those conversations carried by the wind now and then. He never walked down to answer them. Instead, the steady sound of an axe carried down the slope. Split. Another log joined the wall of wood. Split. He pressed fresh clay into a seam beside the cabin door. Split. Then he stood beside the cold pit and judged the depth again with a careful eye, like a man who had once watched 3 people die because someone had misjudged winter by only a few weeks. A few days after that conversation in town, someone finally walked up the north slope without laughter. Dr. Elias Reed made the climb late in the afternoon. Reed was the basin's only physician, a quiet man whose work usually involved mending broken bones, easing fevers, and watching lungs fail during the long winters when smoke and cold crept into every cabin. He carried a small leather satchel and a walking stick polished smooth by years of mountain paths. At first, the visit seemed simple. Reed had heard Ronan Pike sometimes traded smoked venison for supplies that were harder to find on the ridge. Pine salve, liniment, a little alcohol for cleaning tools, the kind of exchange frontier men made without ceremony. But when Reed reached the cabin clearing, he stopped speaking for a moment. Not because of the venison, because of the arrangement. The firewood stacks were not piled the way most men stacked them. They were stored beneath a slanted lean-to roof that left space for air to move, but kept snow from settling deep into the pile. The drying racks stood angled toward the prevailing wind instead of facing the sun directly. Even the cabin door showed care, its lower seams packed tight with clay and moss so drafts could not creep through the floorboards. Reed looked at the cold pit next. He crouched beside it and brushed a little soil away from the stone rim. "You lined it," he said quietly. Ronan nodded once. "Ground stays colder that way," he replied. Reed stood again and watched the drying frames move slightly in the breeze. "Most folks hang food wherever there's room," the doctor said. Ronan shrugged lightly. "Wind dries faster than habit." Reed did not laugh. He had seen too many winters to laugh at preparation. He had watched men grow pale from hunger. He had listened to children coughing through nights when the air inside a cabin was colder than anyone wanted to admit. So instead of joking, Reed simply studied the ridge one more time: the wood, the food, the sealed cabin. Then he nodded once, slowly. For the first time since Ronan Pike began building his quiet machine of survival, someone in Black Hollow Basin looked at the work and recognized it for what it was. Not fear, knowledge. Dr. Elias Reed left the ridge that evening without another word of advice. He did not warn Ronan Pike to slow down. He did not tell the town the man was right, but he did not laugh either. And that silence mattered, because by the last week of August, the land itself had begun speaking in quieter ways. Most people in Black Hollow Basin did not notice the changes. Town life had its own rhythm wagon repairs, flower deliveries, fence mending, church suppers. Small signs in the mountains often passed unseen by people busy with ordinary days. Ronan Pike was not one of those people. One morning, he paused in the yard while carrying a crate of dried pumpkin and watched a flock of geese crossing the sky. Their line ran lower than usual, wings beating closer to the ridges than the wide autumn paths they normally followed. That alone meant little, but 2 days later he saw a pine marten slipping down toward the valley floor, weeks earlier than it should have. Then the wind shifted. Northern air sometimes came early, but this one carried a sharper edge. Not colder yet, just thinner, as if the mountains were already draining warmth away. Down in the basin, the horses noticed before the men did. For 2 nights in a row they turned their bodies the same direction in the pasture, heads angled away from the same stretch of northern sky. Ronan watched these things the way a mechanic studies a machine beginning to vibrate out of alignment. None of the signs alone meant disaster. Together, they meant change. So the work on the ridge quickened. More wood joined the stacked walls beside the shed. More venison was smoked and sealed in cloth. More beans were dried and packed into crocks. The cold pit received a heavier lid and another layer of ash between the crates. From the town below, it looked like the same strange obsession it had always been. But Ronan Pike was not following instinct. He was reading signals. Nature never announced winter with speeches. It only left small corrections in the world. And when too many of those corrections appeared at once, a careful man knew something larger had already begun moving. The signals in the mountains were quiet, but the work on Ronan Pike's ridge was no longer quiet enough to ignore. By early September, even the busiest men in Black Hollow Basin had begun to notice how large the wood stacks had grown. That was when Gideon Thorne decided to climb the hill. He did not come with laughter. Gideon was not the kind of man who wasted time mocking things he did not yet understand. He climbed with the steady pace of someone who had spent most of his life measuring risk in wagons, barrels, and freight contracts. When he reached the clearing, he stood for a moment without speaking. The wood stacks came first to his eye, then the drying racks, then the smoke shed, the sealed cabin seams, the cold pit covered with its fitted lid. Gideon walked slowly through the yard, hands clasped behind his back. "You're laying in winter stores like a trading post," he said at last. Ronan Pike set another split log into the wall and wiped his hands on his trousers. "Winter comes every year," he said. "That it does," Gideon replied. "But not every year comes like this." He gestured toward the ridge and the distant cut in the mountains where the freight road passed. Raven Cut stays open until mid-fall most seasons. Wagons come through. The basin gets its flour, its salt, its tools. If something runs short, another shipment follows. Ronan did not argue. Gideon studied him more closely. "You're planning like the road's already gone," the older man said. Ronan looked out across the basin for a moment before answering. "Road doesn't have to be gone," he said quietly. "Just late." Gideon shook his head slightly. "You're letting an old winter make decisions for a new one." That was the heart of the disagreement. Gideon Thorne believed in the system that had kept Black Hollow Basin supplied for years. Roads opened. Freight arrived. Seasons followed patterns. Ronan Pike believed in something else. He believed that winter did not follow promises, and the two men stood there on the ridge, looking over the same valley, measuring the same future with entirely different mathematics. The disagreement between the two men did not last long. Nature ended it. The first snow came in early September, not in the basin itself. Down in Black Hollow, the ground only felt colder, the mornings sharper. But high above Raven Cut, the peaks turned white overnight. The snow did not look like much from a distance, just a thin, pale band across the ridges. But mountain roads do not need much. The next morning, a freight team was already moving through the cut, wagons heavy with flour sacks and tool crates meant for the basin below. The road curved along a narrow shelf before crossing a small wooden bridge that spanned a deep stone channel. That was where the trouble began. Meltwater from the early snow ran across the trail and froze before sunrise. The lead mule slipped. The wagon lurched sideways. Snow loosened from the slope above and slid down in a heavy sheet. Not a great avalanche. Nothing the newspapers in the rail towns would have printed. Just enough. The sliding weight struck the narrow bridge with a dull crack that echoed between the rock walls. One beam snapped. Then another. The wagon driver jumped clear as the structure collapsed into the dark gap below. By midday, the news had reached Black Hollow Basin. The bridge at Raven Cut was gone. For the first hour, the town treated it like an inconvenience. Men stood outside Mercer Supply, saying the road crews would rebuild it in a week or two. Someone suggested another wagon might come around the South Pass before winter. Gideon Thorne said very little. He simply listened. But high on the North Ridge, Ronan Pike had already stopped splitting wood. He stood looking across the basin toward the distant cut in the mountains. From town, the broken bridge meant a delay. From the ridge, it meant something else entirely. If winter arrived earlier than the old schedules expected, those missing weeks would not be an inconvenience. They would be the line between order and hunger. And for the first time that season, the preparations on Ronan Pike's Hill no longer looked strange. They looked necessary. The broken bridge at Raven Cut did not bring panic to Black Hollow Basin, not at first. Frontier towns were used to setbacks. Roads washed out, wagons overturned. Supplies arrived late, more often than people liked to remember. A delay was not the same thing as disaster. 2 evenings after the news reached town, Gideon Thorne gathered the basin's families inside the small wooden chapel. Oil lamps burned low along the walls, while men and women listened to the basin's most trusted organizer speak in the calm voice that had guided them through many lean seasons. "The bridge can be rebuilt," Gideon said. "Freight routes don't vanish because of one broken span. It may take time, but supplies will come through again." The words settled over the room like a blanket. People wanted to believe them, so the town did what towns often do when trouble arrives. Slowly they waited. At Mercer Supply, Martha Vale began stretching her stock. Flour was measured more carefully. Salt sacks were tied tighter. Barrels were counted at the end of each evening, instead of once a week. Across the basin, Dr. Elias Reed quietly filled a wooden crate with extra bandages, pine salve, cough tonics, and the small medicines he knew winter illness always demanded. No speeches, no warnings, just preparation. But none of it matched what was happening on the North Ridge. Ronan Pike did not pause to see whether the town would prove right or wrong. Inside the cabin, he built another storage shelf along the back wall. He melted animal fat over a steady fire and sealed it in heavy crocks. He lowered part of the drying racks closer to the ground where wind could still reach them but early snow would pass overhead. And outside, beside the already towering stacks of split pine, Ronan lifted his axe again. More wood, another row, joined the wall. From the basin below, it looked almost unreasonable now. The ridge already held enough fuel for what most men would call a normal winter. But Ronan Pike was no longer preparing for normal. He was preparing for what came after people realized they had waited too long. The waiting ended sooner than anyone in Black Hollow Basin expected. The first blizzard arrived in early October. It came without the slow warning most winters gave. One evening, the sky was simply gray and tight over the basin. By midnight, the wind had found its strength. Snow began falling sideways, then harder, then faster. By morning, the drifts were already climbing the sides of fences. The wind moved through the valley like a living thing, bending young pines until their tops scraped the frozen air. Doors had to be pushed open with shoulders. Livestock shelters rattled and groaned where boards had never been meant to face wind like that. The storm did not stop after a few hours. It stayed. For 3 days, the basin disappeared under white movement and roaring air. Inside the town, heat became the first problem. Men who had stacked only modest wood piles found their stoves burning down faster than expected. Fires had to be fed every hour. Ash buckets filled quickly. Cold crept under doors and through window frames. Food followed close behind. At Mercer Supply, Martha Vale stood behind the counter while a small line formed inside the dim store. The shelves were still partly full, but the arithmetic had already changed. She weighed flour for a ranch wife and paused before handing the sack across. "I'm going to split this," she said quietly. The woman looked confused. "Half now," Martha continued. "Half next week." The words felt wrong even as she spoke them. Outside, the wind howled along the empty street. No one laughed anymore about the man on the ridge, because when the storm cleared enough for people to step outside, every eye turned toward the north slope. Through the drifting snow, they could see it, a thin column of smoke rising steadily from Ronan Pike's chimney. The cabin windows glowed faintly behind the trees. Nothing frantic, nothing desperate, just warmth, and that simple sign, smoke, rising calmly into a violent sky, was the first proof that the man they had mocked all summer might have been preparing for something the rest of them had failed to imagine. The storm did not end when the first blizzard passed. It returned in waves. Wind came down the valley again the following week, colder this time. The snow hardened into crusted layers. Footsteps broke through the surface with a brittle crack. Smoke from the basin's chimneys grew thinner as wood piles shrank. On the north ridge, Ronan Pike kept the stove steady. The cabin held warmth because it had been built to hold it. The sealed seams kept the drafts out. The wood stacks beside the shed meant the fire never needed to be starved. Late one night, when the wind pushed hard against the cabin walls, Ronan heard a sound that did not belong to the storm. A knock, not steady, not strong, 3 uneven strikes against the door. Ronan rose from the chair beside the stove and opened it. A boy collapsed inward with the movement. Caleb Dunn, 16 years old, the thin errand runner, who carried parcels between the store, the forge, and the outlying cabins, had climbed the ridge through drifting snow. His coat was stiff with frost. His hands trembled so badly he could not speak. Ronan did not waste time asking questions. First came warmth, but slowly. He guided Caleb near the stove without putting him too close to the heat. Frozen bodies burned easily when thawed too fast. Then he poured a cup of warm water and held it in the boy's hands until the shaking eased. Only after that did Ronan ladle a thin broth from the pot hanging above the stove. Caleb drank in small, careful swallows. Color returned to his face by degrees. When the boy could sit upright again, Ronan spoke. "You work if you stay." Caleb nodded immediately. "You touch nothing unless I say." Another nod. "And you don't tell the basin what's in this cabin." The boy swallowed and nodded a third time. Ronan looked at him a moment longer, then added the final rule. "When trouble comes, you listen." The door closed behind them. Outside, the storm pressed against the ridge. Inside, the fire burned steadily. And for the first time that winter, Ronan Pike's careful preparations were no longer protecting just one life. The storms did not leave after that night. They kept returning. Snow layered over snow until the basin's fences vanished beneath pale ridges. Paths between cabins narrowed into hard-packed tunnels. Every fresh wind erased the tracks of the day before. Inside Black Hollow Basin, wood began disappearing faster than flour. A boy in the far cabins developed a cough that rattled through the thin walls at night. A young girl fainted while helping her mother shovel drifted snow away from a door that no longer opened fully. People had begun counting their food weeks earlier. Now they counted heat. 3 families gathered one gray morning near Mercer Supply. No one said the words aloud at first, but everyone in that small circle already knew the same thought had taken hold. The ridge. Martha Vale was the one who finally spoke it. She wrapped her coat tighter, looked at the children beside them, and said quietly, "We're going up." Gideon Thorne did not come with them. The basin's most respected voice stayed in town, but no one doubted he understood what the climb meant. It meant the town had reached the edge of its pride. The group pushed through waist-high drifts along the slope path until the cabin appeared through the trees. Smoke rose from the chimney, as steady as ever. Ronan Pike opened the door before they knocked. The wind shoved snow across the clearing while the family stood there in silence. No one spoke clearly at first. Requests formed in broken phrases, explanations that did not matter anymore. Ronan did not answer immediately. He looked at the children first. The coughing boy, the pale girl leaning against her mother, 2 smaller ones clinging to thick coats. Only after that did he look at the adults. His voice, when it came, was calm and flat. "The children stay." The parents looked at one another. "You go back," Ronan continued. "You bring wood, work, anything useful. The rule settled over the clearing harder than the wind. Food comes after that." No one argued. The conditions were harsh. Pride stung in the silence that followed. But every parent standing in that snow understood something at the same moment. The cabin on the ridge was no longer just Ronan Pike's home. It was the only place in the basin that had prepared far enough ahead to keep the next generation alive. One by one, the children stepped through the cabin door, and with that quiet movement, the man who had spent the summer stacking wood and drying food became something else entirely, the keeper of the ridge. Once the children entered the cabin, the ridge changed. What had been a solitary shelter built for one careful man slowly turned into something else, a small society. Ronan Pike did not try to comfort the children with stories or soft promises. That was not the kind of help he knew how to give. Instead, he gave them work. Work was steadier than fear. Caleb Dunn, the boy who had arrived first, became the one who helped keep order. Ronan showed him where everything belonged and how every small task mattered. "Kindling first," Ronan told him one morning, handing him a short stack of split sticks. "Count it." Caleb stacked the pieces carefully near the stove. From then on, he counted them every night. The younger children were given lighter jobs. One swept the floor each morning so damp snow would not melt into the wood. Another turned the last racks of dried fruit near the wall so air could still reach them. 2 others bundled herbs and onion greens into small cords for storage. Even the smallest hands had something to do. Routine spread through the cabin the way warmth spread from the stove. Morning meant checking the fire and measuring wood. Midday meant rotating food stores and drying wet gloves near the heat. Evening meant counting the supplies again, before the lamps were lowered. The discipline kept the cold from creeping too far inside their thoughts. A week later, Dr. Elias Reed climbed the ridge again, carrying a small crate through the drifts. Inside were cough tonics, bandages, and the few medicines he could spare from the basin. He examined the children one by one. Their breathing was steady. Their skin carried color instead of the pale gray Reed had expected. No fevers, no deep coughs. The doctor nodded once as he turned to Ronan. "Your system's holding," he said quietly. Outside, Martha Vale watched the children hauling small bundles of wood to the porch and stacking them with serious concentration. For months, she had thought the ridge was the place where a stubborn man hid his excess. Now she saw something different. Preparation had become structure. Structure had become survival. And inside that cabin, long winter nights were not endured by hope alone. They were carried through by order, rationing, and the steady presence of a man who wasted neither motion nor fire. Winter had tested the basin already, but the true trial had not yet arrived. It came later, in a storm people would remember for years afterward, the one they eventually called the Long White of '86. The wind changed first. It no longer pushed snow across the valley floor. It lifted it, the air filled with white movement that erased distance and direction at the same time. Drifts climbed higher than fences. Barn doors disappeared halfway beneath packed walls of snow. In the basin below, livestock sheds sagged under the weight. Chimneys groaned where ice gathered along the bricks. When the wind struck the valley head-on, it made a long, metallic sound that seemed to twist through every stove, pipe, and roof beam. Inside many homes, fires began failing. Wood ran short. Men who had believed their piles would last the season began feeding chairs, broken fence rails, and tool handles into their stoves. Cooking pots held thinner meals each night. Stews stretched across more bowls. No speeches marked the change. The basin simply began losing ground. Up on the ridge, Ronan Pike shifted the cabin into something closer to siege than shelter. The rules tightened. Rations were reduced slightly, but served on a steady schedule. Fires were fed with the thick overnight blocks he had split months earlier. The door stayed closed unless work demanded otherwise. Children slept in rotation near the stove, so no one stayed too long in the cold edges of the room. Wet boots were dried carefully, never too close to the heat where leather might crack. Every movement inside the cabin had a purpose. Every stick of wood had a future hour assigned to it. Outside, the storm built its white walls higher around the ridge. Down in Black Hollow Basin, families who had trusted an ordinary winter were beginning to fall behind the arithmetic. No one needed to say what was happening. Nature had already cast its vote. It was deciding who had understood the season early enough to live through it. Weeks passed under that white siege. By the time the worst winds finally eased, Black Hollow Basin had changed in ways no one could pretend not to see. Wood piles were gone in many yards. Smoke rose thinner from chimneys that had once burned day and night. Doors stayed closed longer because there was less heat to lose. And slowly, one realization began spreading through the basin. The ridge had been right. For a long time, Gideon Thorne resisted that conclusion. As the basin's storehouse owner and the man who had guided freight routes and supply schedules for years, he carried the weight of the town's confidence. Leaders did not abandon their judgments lightly, but leadership also meant recognizing when survival required a different answer. One gray morning, Gideon left the basin and began the climb toward the North Ridge. The snow reached past his knees in places. The wind had carved sharp ridges into the drifts. It was not a climb a man made for pride. When he reached Ronan Pike's clearing, he stopped for a moment, just as Dr. Elias Reed had weeks earlier. But the scene had changed. Children moved between the cabin and the woodshed, carrying small bundles of kindling. Caleb Dunn stacked wood along the porch rail with quiet efficiency. The smoke from the chimney rose steady into the pale sky, and the great wall of split pine still stood beside the shed. Gideon studied the stacks carefully. They were not random piles anymore. They were measured reserves, wood meant to last through the remaining cold. He finally turned toward Ronan. "You saw this coming," Gideon said. Ronan Pike did not answer immediately. Instead, he stepped inside the cabin and returned with a folded sheet of paper. On it were names, families from the basin, homes where older people lived, cabins where children still needed heat, houses where wood had already run out. Ronan handed the paper to Gideon. "Start there," he said simply. No apology passed between them, no speech about who had been right. But Gideon Thorne understood the meaning of the moment. The basin would survive the rest of that winter only if it began using the same careful arithmetic that Ronan Pike had trusted months before anyone else believed it necessary. Gideon Thorne carried Ronan Pike's list back down the ridge, and from that day forward, the basin began working from a different set of numbers. Wood was moved where it mattered most. The strongest men hauled sleds through drifts to cabins where older hands could no longer split their own fuel. Children and mothers were moved closer to heat. Supplies were stretched, counted, and stretched again. Winter did not loosen its grip quickly, but it loosened. Slowly, the storms weakened. The wind lost its cutting edge. The long, white walls of snow began shrinking under pale sunlight. By the time the thaw finally reached Black Hollow Basin, the valley looked like a place that had been scraped clean of its old assumptions. The bridge at Raven Cut would be rebuilt. Freight wagons would return. Barrels of flour and crates of tools would once again arrive from the rail towns far beyond the mountains. In time, the basin would sound like itself again. Men would talk about horses. Women would trade seeds and garden plans. Children would run between cabins where the snow had once buried the fences. But one thing had changed. The basin no longer treated summer as leisure. At Mercer's Supply, Martha Vale began ordering flour and salt weeks earlier than she ever had before. Gideon Thorne oversaw the building of a shared wood reserve on high ground instead of near the creek, where floods sometimes reached it. Dr. Elias Reed wrote down a careful list of medicines and dried supplies that every household should keep through the warm months. Preparation had become common sense, and the children who had spent the winter on the ridge remembered those months in Ronan Pike's cabin like a hard season of schooling. They remembered counting kindling, rotating dried fruit, watching the fire so no spark was wasted. Ronan Pike never gave a speech about any of it. When the snow receded, he simply opened the cabin shutters and removed the boards that had sealed the door against winter wind. He checked the cold pit, turned the soil where new racks would stand, and began cutting the first small stacks of wood for the coming year. The sun had barely begun to warm the ridge, but Ronan Pike was already preparing again, because men who truly understand winter never mistake survival for victory. They treat it as a responsibility to be earned again the next year. If you saw a neighbor storing food and wood all summer like Ronan Pike, would you think he was wise or completely crazy?